Have you ever wondered when our modern world truly began? It wasn't with a single date on a calendar or the flip of a switch. Instead, it was a slow, powerful change, like a great tide turning. The period we call the dawn of modernity, roughly from the late 1700s to the mid-1800s, was one of the most explosive and transformative times in all of human history. It was an age of giant leaps forward in technology, brutal and sprawling wars that redrew the map of Europe, and the aggressive expansion of empires across the globe. This era didn't just change how people lived, it fundamentally reshaped their understanding of the world, their place in it, and what the future could hold for them and their children. Imagine a world lit only by candles and firelight, where the fastest you could travel was the speed of a horse. This was the reality for almost everyone before this period. News traveled slowly, carried by messengers on foot or horseback. Most people were born, lived and died in the same small village, working the land just as their ancestors had for centuries. Their lives were governed by the seasons and the rising and setting of the sun. But then something incredible began to happen. New ideas, new machines, and new ambitions started to bubble up, primarily in Europe, and they would soon spill over and change the entire planet in ways no one could have predicted. This essay will take you on a journey back to that incredible time. We'll explore three massive forces that work together to build the foundations of the world we live in today. First, we'll look at the Industrial Revolution, a time when steam and iron replaced muscle and wood, creating factories, booming cities, and incredible new inventions. Then, we'll march alongside the armies of the Napoleonic Wars, led by one of history's most famous figures, and see how these conflicts changed nations forever. Finally, we'll sail across the oceans to understand the age of colonialism, where European powers built vast empires that connected and divided the world in new and often painful ways. Understanding this period is not just a history lesson, it's about understanding ourselves. The way we work, the countries we live in, the technology we use, and even the global challenges we face today all have their roots in this revolutionary age. It was a time of brilliant invention and terrible suffering, of grand dreams and harsh realities. By exploring the dawn of modernity, we can see the blueprint of our own time. So, let's step back in time and witness the birth of the modern world, an era of smoke, steel, and gunpowder that forged the path to the 21st century. The Industrial Revolution was quite simply the biggest change in how humans made things since the invention of farming thousands of years earlier. It began in Great Britain in the late 18th century and was all about a shift from making goods by hand to making them with machines. Before this, a weaver might spend a whole day creating a single piece of cloth in their cottage. But with new inventions like the spinning jenny and the power loom, a factory could produce hundreds of times that amount in the same time. This wasn't just a small improvement, it was a complete game changer that altered the very fabric of society, creating new jobs, new wealth, and new problems on a scale never seen before. The heart of this revolution was a new source of power: steam. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the 1770s were truly revolutionary. Suddenly you had a machine that could do the work of countless horses or people, and it never got tired. It could power looms in a textile factory, pump water out of deep coal mines, and most famously drive locomotives along iron rails. Coal became the fuel of this new age, and Britain, with its vast reserves of coal and iron, was the perfect place for this fire to start. This new technology created a cycle. Steam engines needed coal, so mining deepened, and deeper mines needed steam engines to pump out water, creating an ever-growing demand for both. This wave of invention went far beyond just textiles and steam. Iron production soared thanks to new techniques that made it cheaper and stronger. This better iron was used to build everything from the machines themselves to bridges and the railways that would soon crisscross the country. Think of the Iron Bridge in Shropshire, completed in 1779. It was the first of its kind in the world, a powerful symbol of this new industrial age. It showed that humans could now build things that were previously unimaginable. This spirit of innovation was everywhere as inventors and entrepreneurs raced to create the next big thing, hoping to make their fortune in this brave new world of industry. So, the Industrial Revolution wasn't just one invention, it was a chain reaction of many. It was about harnessing new forms of energy to power new machines made from new materials, which in turn created new industries. This shift from an agricultural handmade world to an industrial machine-made one was the engine that drove the creation of modern life. It changed where people lived, what jobs they did, and how they saw their place in the world. The quiet, rural landscape of the past was being rapidly replaced by the noisy, smoky, and dynamic landscape of the factory and the city. As the factories grew, they acted like giant magnets, pulling people away from the countryside and into rapidly expanding towns and cities. For centuries, most people had lived in small villages, but now, for the first time in history, cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow began to explode in size. People came in search of work, hoping for a better life than the one they could find on the farm. This mass migration, known as urbanization, was one of the most significant social changes of the era. It created a completely new type of human settlement, the industrial city, a place of incredible energy but also of immense challenges and hardships. Life in these new cities was a shocking contrast to the rural life people had left behind. The streets were often unpaved, crowded and filthy. Housing was built quickly and cheaply, with families often crammed into single rooms in poorly constructed tenement buildings. There was no proper sanitation, and clean water was a luxury. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread by contaminated water swept through these new urban slums, killing thousands. The air itself was thick with smoke and soot from the countless factory chimneys that dominated the skyline, blocking out the sun and turning buildings black. It was a harsh and often brutal environment, a far cry from the fresh air of the countryside. The nature of work itself was also completely transformed. In the past, work on a farm followed the rhythm of the seasons. In the factory, work followed the relentless rhythm of the machine. The factory whistle dictated when you started and when you stopped. Shifts were long, often 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The work was repetitive, dangerous, and demanding. There were no safety regulations, and horrific accidents involving machinery were common. Even children were put to work, their small hands seen as useful for fixing threads in textile mills or crawling through narrow tunnels in coal mines. This new working class, or proletariat, had a life experience that was entirely different from any generation that had come before. However, it wasn't all negative. These cities were also centers of incredible opportunity and change. They gave rise to a new middle class of factory owners, engineers, and merchants who became fantastically wealthy. The concentration of people and ideas in cities also led to new social and political movements. Workers began to band together to form trade unions to fight for better wages and safer conditions. Newspapers, public meetings, and new ideas about democracy and rights flourished in this dynamic urban environment. The industrial city was a place of extreme contrasts, of wealth and poverty, of opportunity and despair, of progress and pollution, all existing side by side. While Britain was being transformed by industry, mainland Europe was being shaken by war. At the center of this storm was one of the most brilliant and controversial figures in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on the small island of Corsica, Napoleon rose through the ranks of the French army during the chaos of the French Revolution. He was a military genius, known for his incredible energy, his ability to inspire his soldiers, and his clever battlefield tactics. By 1799, he had seized power in France, and in 1804 he crowned himself emperor. For the next decade, he would dominate Europe, leading his armies in a series of conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he was also a powerful ruler who brought major changes to France and the lands he conquered. He created a new set of laws called the Napoleonic Code. This was a huge step forward because it said that the law should be the same for all citizens regardless of their birth or religion. It protected property rights and created a more organized and efficient government. Many of the legal systems in Europe and around the world are still based on the ideas in his code. He reorganized the French government, created a central bank, and reformed the education system, building the foundations of the modern French state. His ambition, however, was not limited to France. Napoleon believed he could unite all of Europe under his leadership. He led his grand army on incredible campaigns across the continent, defeating the powerful armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. At the height of his power, his empire stretched from Spain to Poland. He placed his relatives and loyal marshals on the thrones of conquered kingdoms, redrawing the map of Europe to suit his own design. For many, he was a liberator who brought the modern ideas of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, to the old feudal kingdoms of Europe. For others, he was a tyrant, a warmonger who drained their countries of men and money. Napoleon's story is a classic tale of ambition, power, and eventual downfall. He represented a new kind of leader, one who came to power not through royal blood, but through talent and force of will. He was a product of the revolutionary age, a man who showed that an individual could change the course of history. His presence on the world stage was so immense that this entire period of European history is often simply called the Age of Napoleon. He was a force of nature who tore down the old world of kings and aristocrats and in its place helped to forge the beginnings of a new, more modern Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged from 1803 to 1815, were unlike any conflicts Europe had seen before. They were fought on a massive scale, involving huge armies and battles that stretched across the entire continent, from the fields of Spain to the frozen plains of Russia. These were not small wars between kings over a piece of land, they were ideological struggles. On one side was Napoleon's France, representing the new ideas of revolution and national power. On the other were the old monarchies of Europe, Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia, who fought to restore the old order and contain French ambition. The wars mobilized entire nations, requiring vast amounts of soldiers, supplies and money. One of Napoleon's most famous campaigns was his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. He led a massive army of over 600,000 soldiers deep into Russian territory. But the Russians refused to fight a decisive battle. Instead, they retreated deeper and deeper into their vast country, burning crops and villages as they went. Napoleon captured Moscow, but the city was set on fire, leaving his army with no food or shelter as the brutal Russian winter began. The retreat was a catastrophe. Starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant attacks from Russian forces destroyed the Grand Army. Fewer than 100,000 men staggered back out of Russia. This was a turning point that severely weakened Napoleon's power. The final act of the wars came at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After escaping from his first exile, Napoleon returned to France and quickly raised another army. The powers of Europe, led by Britain's Duke of Wellington and Prussia's Gebhard von Blücher, gathered to face him one last time. The battle, fought in modern-day Belgium, was a brutal day-long struggle. In the end, the timely arrival of the Prussian army helped to crush the French forces. Napoleon was defeated for good and was exiled to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died 6 years later. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of an era of constant warfare that had engulfed Europe for over a decade. The impact of the Napoleonic Wars was profound and long-lasting. The wars had spread new ideas about nationalism and liberty across the continent. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of a king, but as members of a nation with a shared language and culture. This feeling of nationalism would lead to the unification of countries like Germany and Italy later in the century. The old Holy Roman Empire was dissolved. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 tried to put Europe back together, but the seeds of change had been planted. The wars had exhausted the old powers, paving the way for Britain, which had been transformed by industry and controlled the seas, to become the world's dominant power for the next century. While Europe was busy with revolutions and wars, its most powerful nations were also looking outwards, building huge empires across the globe. This process, known as colonialism, was driven by the new forces of the modern age. The Industrial Revolution created a massive demand for raw materials like cotton, rubber and sugar, which could be found in Africa, Asia and the Americas. Factories also produced huge quantities of manufactured goods, and colonies provided new captive markets where these goods could be sold. So the desire for economic profit was a major reason why countries like Britain, France, Spain and the Netherlands sought to control distant lands. But it wasn't just about money. There was also a strong sense of national pride and competition involved. Owning a large empire was seen as a sign of being a great and powerful nation. Countries raced against each other to claim territory. a rivalry that became known as the Scramble for Africa later in the 19th century. There was a popular saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because it was so vast that it was always daytime somewhere within its territories. This competition for colonies created a global chessboard where European powers moved to block each other and expand their own influence around the world. A third and more complex justification for colonialism was a belief in cultural and racial superiority. Many Europeans at the time believed that their civilization, with its Christian religion, advanced technology and political systems, was the most advanced in the world. They saw it as their duty, what the British writer Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, to bring their way of life to what they considered uncivilized peoples. Missionaries traveled to colonies to spread Christianity, while colonial administrators tried to impose European laws, education and customs on the local populations. This belief was often used to justify the often brutal and exploitative nature of colonial rule. So, colonialism was a complicated mix of economic greed, national rivalry and a sense of cultural mission. It was made possible by the technological advantages that Europe had gained during the Industrial Revolution. Steamships made it easier to travel to and control distant lands. Advanced weapons like the Maxim gun gave small European armies a massive advantage over local forces. The same forces that were reshaping life within Europe, industry, technology and nationalism, were now being projected outwards to reshape the entire world, creating a global system where a few powerful nations in the West held dominance over vast populations in the global South. The arrival of colonial powers had a massive and often devastating impact on the lives of people in Asia, Africa and the Americas. The first and most immediate effect was the loss of independence. Local rulers were overthrown, ancient kingdoms were dismantled, and entire societies were brought under the control of a foreign government thousands of miles away. Colonial administrators drew new borders on maps, often cutting through existing ethnic and cultural groups or forcing rival groups to live together in a single colony. These artificial boundaries are the source of many political conflicts and civil wars that continue to affect countries in Africa and the Middle East today. Economically, colonialism transformed local economies to serve the needs of the mother country. Instead of growing a variety of crops for their own communities, farmers were often forced to grow cash crops like cotton, tea or rubber for export to European factories. This focus on a single crop could lead to food shortages and famine. Local industries and crafts that competed with European manufactured goods were often discouraged or destroyed. The wealth and resources of the colonies, their minerals, timber and agricultural products, were extracted and shipped to Europe, enriching the colonial powers while leaving the colonies themselves impoverished and dependent on their rulers. Socially and culturally, colonialism was deeply disruptive. European languages, laws and education systems were imposed, often at the expense of local traditions and knowledge. Christian missionaries worked to convert people, sometimes viewing local religions and customs as barbaric or pagan. A small local elite was often educated in the European style to help run the colony, creating a new social class that was sometimes disconnected from its own people. This created a sense of cultural confusion and loss, as people were taught to see their own heritage as inferior to that of the colonizers. This legacy of cultural and psychological impact is one of the deepest and longest-lasting effects of the colonial experience. However, the story is not entirely one-sided. Colonial rule did, in some cases, bring new infrastructure like railways, roads, and telegraph lines, although these were usually built to help extract resources more efficiently. Western medicine was introduced, which helped to fight some diseases. Yet these potential benefits came at an enormous cost. The experience of being ruled by a foreign power, the economic exploitation, and the cultural disruption created deep resentments. It also unintentionally planted the seeds of its own destruction by introducing ideas of nationalism and liberty, which colonial subjects would eventually use to fight for their own independence in the 20th century. The great transformations of the early modern era, the Industrial Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the rise of colonialism are not just dusty relics of the past. They are the architects of the world we inhabit today, and their echoes can be heard in almost every aspect of our modern lives. The very idea of a globalized economy where goods, money, and information flow freely across borders has its roots in this period. The Industrial Revolution created the first truly international system of trade, linking the factories of Europe with the raw materials and markets of faraway colonies. The patterns of wealth and inequality we see today, with a rich global north and a developing global south, were largely established during this time. The political map of our world was also drawn during this era. The Napoleonic Wars helped unleash the powerful force of nationalism. The idea that people with a common language, culture, and history should have their own independent state. This idea fueled the creation of nations like Italy and Germany in the 19th century and continued to inspire independence movements throughout the 20th century. At the same time, the artificial borders created by colonial powers in Africa and Asia continue to be a source of tension and conflict. The political systems, legal codes, and even the languages spoken in many countries are a direct legacy of their French, British, or Spanish colonial past. Our relationship with technology and the environment is another direct inheritance from this period. The Industrial Revolution began our society's dependence on fossil fuels like coal and later oil and gas. This has powered incredible technological progress and raised living standards for many, but it is also the origin of our current climate crisis. The belief that nature is something to be conquered and exploited for human benefit, a hallmark of the industrial age, is now being seriously questioned as we face the consequences of pollution, resource depletion, and climate change. The challenges we face today are a direct result of the path we started down over 2 centuries ago. Furthermore, the very structure of our society reflects these changes. The shift from rural to urban living that began in the industrial cities of Britain is now a global phenomenon, with more than half of the world's population living in cities. The class structures that emerged, with a working class, a middle class, and a wealthy elite, still define our societies in many ways. Debates about workers' rights, the role of government, and the distribution of wealth are continuations of conversations that began in the factories and political clubs of the 19th century. In short, to understand the world today, we must first understand its chaotic and revolutionary birth. The dawn of the modern era was a whirlwind of change, a period when the world was fundamentally remade in the span of just a few generations. The Industrial Revolution, with its smoking factories and powerful steam engines, forever altered how humanity worked, lived, and thought about progress. It set us on a path of technological innovation that continues to accelerate today. But it also created new social divisions and environmental challenges that we are still grappling with. The clatter of the first power looms in Manchester was the sound of a new world being born. A world of mass production, urban life, and relentless change. At the same time, the Napoleonic Wars tore through the old political order of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man of immense talent and ambition, was the embodiment of this new dynamic age. His armies marched across the continent, spreading the revolutionary ideas of liberty and nationalism, even as they brought conflict and destruction. The wars he unleashed redrew the map of Europe and shifted the balance of power, ending an old era of aristocratic rule and setting the stage for the rise of the modern nation-state. The idea that a nation's people, not just its king, held power was a radical concept that would reshape politics forever. Finally, the expansion of colonial empires connected the world in an unprecedented, albeit unequal way. Driven by the economic needs of industry and a sense of national superiority, European powers imposed their rule over vast swathes of the globe. This created a global system of power and wealth that benefited the colonizers at the expense of the colonized. The legacy of colonialism is complex and painful, visible today in the political instability, economic challenges, and cultural identities of many nations around the world. It created the interconnected, yet deeply divided planet that we have inherited. These three great forces did not happen in isolation. They fed into one another, creating a perfect storm of transformation. Industrial technology gave European nations the power to build empires, while the competition for those empires fueled national rivalries. The ideas of nationalism, unleashed by war, would eventually inspire colonized peoples to fight for their freedom. Understanding this pivotal era is essential because we are living in the world it created. The foundations of our global economy, our political systems, and our technological society were all laid during this turbulent and revolutionary time. The dawn of modernity was not just a chapter in a history book, it was the beginning of our own story.